Hey everybody. Sorry it took a little bit to get going there, and hopefully you can see me okay. Uh, so it's that time of year where some of us teachers and some of us students have to turn in our laptops that are issued by the school and then use our own personal ones. And so my guess is that I'm a little bit more orange than usual, although it is getting a little bit hotter up here in Michigan where I come from. My name is Mr. Lagerway, and I'm here to do the best that I can. To be able to walk you through some of these APUSH review questions. Sorry, the color is weird. In the chat, if you could let me know, is there any sort of delay or lag for you, or is it just that there's a weird color? Because it's a bit lagged for me, but as long as you can hear me and as long as you can see me, we should be able to do this thing nicely. For those of you taking it tomorrow, good luck. That's fantastic. So yeah, in the chat, are we able to hear me and see me okay? Just let me know as we get going. All right, so I'd like to be able to share my screen with you folks a second. And so that way we can start getting started, debriefing some of these 2019 exam review questions. And let's talk about, first of all, my name is Mr. Lagerway, as I think I said before, but then again, I've been kind of doing a little bit scrambling at the last minute here with some new technology. And I come to you from Michigan, and my students all took the operational APUSH exam a couple weeks ago, and I know that some of you are taking it tomorrow with the late exam. Best of luck, and hopefully what we're going to be able to do today is go over the released FRQs and then give you a sense of what you can expect. Obviously, you're going to have different questions, but how can you learn from the past test? What can you take forward? And for those of you that already took it, what can you do in terms of learning from your mistakes, learning from your successes, and how will that enable you to be more successful as you go on later and perhaps take AP Euro, take AP World, whatever the sequence is. So hopefully the color's not too weird on this. So with Fiveable, let's go into the operational FRQs, shall we? So kind of outline of tonight, I want to give you an overview and initial reaction. We're going to go through the SAQs, we're going to go through the DBQ, that monster, and then the LEQs in order. By the way, if you have some questions as we go, feel free to ask a question down below, and feel free to put some questions in the chat as well, and I'll try to answer those as best that I can. So without further ado, my initial reaction to the 2019 free response questions. By the way, this is just the operational exam, and you folks are smart, you know this, but if you took an exam already that was not released, you cannot talk about it, because until it is released, it is secret, it is copyrighted, and you don't want to get in trouble with the College Board. So if you took this one, feel free to talk about all the writing that you want, but you can't talk about the multiple choice, and you can't talk about any other exam versions, and I won't be talking about those either, because to be honest, I don't know about those. Sophia, it sounds like some people are taking the exam tomorrow because they're taking the late one, which is scheduled for the 23rd of May. So for whatever reason, they had another exam scheduled during the APUSH initial one, or they had too many snow days, or they were sick, or something like that. Late testing for a variety of reasons. Got to make sure we stay hydrated, right? So my initial reaction was that these were doable and you have choices. It doesn't matter which one you had, if you had the operational or you had secret ones or you're taking the late one, you have choices. So let me emphasize this, and I'll emphasize it again. Please make sure that you do the one that you think you will do the best on, not the one that you think is the hardest, right? That comes to the SAQs, that comes to the LEQs, that comes to what documents you're going to analyze. Make sure that you're doing the ones that are the easiest for you to do. So without further ado, let's do some SAQs here. Timing, at least for my students, was the tightest on this. And so if you're taking the exam tomorrow or you're doing AP World or AP Euro in advance, make sure you use your time wisely, right? The importance of acing. Keep in mind that you want to make sure that you're dropping specific vocab words. That's sort of your citation there as you're answering the question. And then make sure you loop it back. As I've talked to many people that have graded SAQs before, they always say, you can't just have a laundry list of vocab words. You got to get specific. So we'll talk about how you do that specifically with this prompt and the ones that you see here on the operational, but obviously do that if you have different ones coming up. Then vocab, definition, and then tie it back to the question, which we already said. Sorry about that. And then dates. If you happen to catch any of my earlier streams, I talked about the importance of dates. Dates are incredibly important in AP US history. They're a little bit less important in AP World, but you still need to know dates, especially for APUSH, in order to be able to write the proper vocab. So let's get into the SAQ. The first one is SAQ number 1. This is always interpretation. And if you don't mind, I'm going to get myself a slightly bigger version of this by downloading it. Although it doesn't seem to be working right now. It seems like we got the pinwheel circle of death. So pardon me with my old computer just for a second. What we're basically going to be doing is uh-oh. It seemed to be super frozen. Hopefully it's still working for you folks. But that first SAQ is always going to be a stimulus-based one, and it is always going to involve secondary historians. Hey, I think we're back. Sorry about that. I'll turn on my screen again and go back to the slideshow, and we can dive right back into those SAQs. Just to make sure, feel free to throw something in the chat real quick if you can hear me and if this is all working out. And hopefully we'll be able to proceed without any glitches here. I'll try not to do anything fancy. Are we doing okay? Can everybody hear me? Can everybody see the slide loading, at least for right now? And then now we're on SAQ Interpretation 1. We good? All right. Thank you, Josie. Appreciate it. Sorry about that. So once again, I was saying the SAQ number 1 is always interpretation, right? So this is the one that involves historians. The one that was on the operational was very nice and straightforward. It involved 2 historians talking about the lives of women in the Revolutionary War. Now, how can you tell that, and what sort of things could you use going forward, potentially if you're taking the exam tomorrow? Well, always pay attention, of course, to the citations, right? In this case, if you notice women, seaports, and social change, and then you notice women in politics in the early American Republic, chances are pretty good they're talking about women. Now, you could also look at the questions where it says the impact of the American Revolution on women. I like to read the citations and the questions before I even read the actual excerpts themselves. I find that to be very helpful. This one was pretty straightforward. Essentially, Crane says the American Revolution didn't really change a whole lot for American women. As you can see there, it was neither radical nor a watershed. And then you can also see that some people, then Zachary says that it was much more of a difference. And so Crane believes the American Revolution didn't really result in significant change, whereas Zachary, women are valued after the Revolution, and they're more valued because they have a more modern interpretation of historical events, perhaps, because she's writing later. But either way, there's a clear difference there. And you probably picked that up for part A. Part B, you need to talk about something that would support Crane's argument, as in what can show that the American Revolution did not change a whole lot of stuff for women. Well, there's a whole bunch of options we can work with here, right? The fact that there's no suffrage for women, there's limited availability of formal education, the fact that there are still coverture laws that limit the rights of married women, the fact that Republican motherhood still exists. Republican motherhood is what most of my students talked about. Please know about that. Keep in mind, though, that there are dates. And so one event, development, or circumstance from the period 1765 to 1800 that's not explicitly mentioned. So, Louisa, Seneca Falls Convention would be fantastic, except it's in 1848. It's thus beyond the scope of the SAQ question. So that's, again, why dates are so important. So Seneca Falls Convention certainly works in the sense that, like, you could say women don't have suffrage during this time and they won't get it until much, much later, and they fought for it during Seneca Falls. But essentially, you're not getting any evidence points for using Seneca Falls unless you say no voting rights during the period that they mentioned, 1765, which is like the Stamp Act era, and then 1800, we're talking colonial America during the Revolution, and then immediately after during that critical period through John Adams's presidency. Then Zachary's argument, you could say Republican motherhood for this one as well. Now remember, you cannot double dip. But you could say Republican motherhood for both of them. You could say Crane could use Republican motherhood to say, yeah, they still don't have a right to vote. They're given this task at home, but they don't really have the idea. And then you could talk about Zachary and say, well, Republican motherhood works because it shows they have a valued role in creating an educated citizenry after the Republic gets started after the Revolutionary War, for sure. Jing Long, let's see. Link to the slideshow. I think we'll be able to do that for you. Yeah. Let me do that at the end just so I don't get any tech glitches and mess anything up for you. Absolutely. Daughters of Liberty works for Zagaris. Absolutely. Molly Pitcher, colonial boycotts. There's not a ton of evidence you can use here, but Daughters of Liberty would definitely be my go-to for sure. Women worked as nurses during this time. Let's see. You could talk about rhetoric for founding documents. You could talk about Mercy Otis Warren and other important female writers of the era. Abigail Adams talking about remember the ladies, the fact that she had the power to ask, but also the fact that she had to ask. You could use it for either one. So that's SAQ number one. Fairly straightforward, but also fairly narrow. Not a lot of options for you. SAQ number two, remember, is always a stimulus question. So it always has some sort of picture, a chart, a cartoon, an excerpt. SAQ 2 is always a stimulus. This one was talking about the March of Destiny. So, of course, your mind went immediately to Manifest Destiny. That's really important. And you notice here that they had California and Kentucky. People are moving west toward the sun, where I guess the sun is setting, which is a little bit confusing. But either way, it's sort of this idea of the March of Destiny. Just like the sun is bound to set in the west, we are bound to settle in the west. And either way, then it talks about a historical perspective observed in this image. So keep in mind that you could say Manifest Destiny, but that's not really a historical perspective, right? You can say what that is, but it has to talk about how it's a positive view of westward expansion, a positive view of Manifest Destiny. Explorers and settlers are viewed as heroic adventurers and conquerors. Notice these guys wearing fur-trimmed hats up in Kentucky, going all the way out to California, doing some gold rushing, perhaps. But either way, the artist clearly thinks this is a good thing, and thus you get your answer to number 1. It can be pretty general. If you want to drop some evidence in there and say manifest destiny, that would be the place to do it. But for sure, say that it is a positive interpretation. So when you see a stimulus-based SAQ number 2, perhaps on the exam tomorrow, perhaps on another exam that you take for another AP history, remember, if it asks you for perspective, you have to talk about what's going on and how does the author of the cartoon feel about it. In this case, manifest destiny, westward movement, it's a good thing. So it works out well. Then you look at letter B, briefly explain one historical event or development in the period 1800 to 1850 contributed to the process depicted in the image. And so you have a ton of options here. This was a very nice one. So you could talk about Lewis and Clark. You could talk about the Louisiana Purchase, right? You could talk about the War of 1812, which leads to increased nationalism. You could talk about the American system and transportation increases. You could talk about the Oregon Trail, California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Trail of Tears that happened under Jackson, the migration of Mormons, Texas settlement, John L. O'Sullivan. I could go on and on. Most people probably mentioned the California Gold Rush that happened in 1849. You can remember that, of course, because the San Francisco 49ers. You could maybe talk about railroads, Nithya, in the next section. You could talk about, no, I should be very clear here. Sorry. You can talk about railroads as part of the American system and increases in infrastructure. Absolutely. But you want to make sure it's the antebellum railroads, as in America becomes much more connected, and you've seen that before. So yeah, I take that back. You could mention railroads at either one. If you're doing transcontinental railroad, then you want to save that for letter C. So that's where dates become important again, right? So if you want to say that the East and the West was becoming way more connected because of railroads, that obviously works too. But then again, this is why dates are so important for history classes, particularly for APUSH. So if you have the opportunity and you're taking the exam tomorrow and you want a quick review of some important dates and why they're important, I have another one of those fiveable streams that you can watch if you have a Plus subscription and see the one on dates. I think it's fairly useful because I think dates are so important for APUSH, but they're also useful for other ones too. So notice this one goes 1800, aka Jefferson, all the way to 1850, aka the end of the Mexican-American War, Compromise of 1850, Mexican Cession, all that stuff works. And then we look at letter C, and this says an effect from 1844 to 1890 that resulted from the process in the picture. So this is where my mind would go to a lot of postbellum stuff, talking about Native Americans perhaps. But here's the thing, it goes all the way back to 1844. So you can still do the Mexican Cession. You can still do the Gold Rush. You can still do the Compromise of 1850, the California Native Genocide, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, Civil War, as long as you tie it back to westward expansion. And I always tell my students, and I think you folks know this too, westward expansion equals conflicts over slavery equals Civil War. We'll talk about that with the LEQ, but this is going to be a big deal. And then after the Civil War, you can talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. You can talk about the Dawes Severalty Act, the Battle of Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, because it goes all the way to 1890, the Turner Frontier Thesis, if you want to get really technical. But either way, Native Americans lose land as American white settlers continue to move west, and that's a constant theme you're going to be able to see and talk about in SAQ number 2, unfortunately. Decimation of the buffalo, if you want to talk about environmental stuff as well. On to SAQ number 3. Now remember, you have a choice here between 2 and 3, or sorry, between 3 and 4, and they're both comparisons. So this is comparison option number 1. You got comparison option number 2. Again, go with the one that you think is the best for you, that you know the most about, right? So if it says describe one difference between the economies of British North American colonies in the Chesapeake region, such as Virginia and Maryland, they even told you which ones they were, and the Chesapeake, and the economies of the middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania and New York, and they tell you which they are. That's very helpful, and hopefully you'll do okay on this one. Again, if it's comparison, give something from both sides. SAQ number 3 is either going to be causation or comparison. Whichever it is, SAQ number 4 is going to be the same, and it's going to be the opposite of number 2. So if you're answering this question on the exam tomorrow, and it's a completely different question, which of course it was going to be, keep in mind that the skill is going to be the same, and if it's comparison, you want to make sure you're giving something from both sides. So the British North American colonies in the Chesapeake are more labor-intensive cash crops, tobacco, right? Whereas the middle colonies are going to be more bread baskets, so a lot of wheat and things like that. So you want to give something for both, right? The Chesapeake is large plantations. The middle one is more small farms, let's say. The middle has less reliance on slave labor and indentured servants, whereas the Chesapeake is going to have a lot more coerced labor. Absolutely. Middle colonies has more emphasis on seaport trading. See, New York City, of course. And then larger cities with relatively urban economies Philadelphia, et cetera, at least compared to the Chesapeake region. And then part B asks for a similarity in economy. I absolutely would go right here, and hopefully you've seen a lot of SAQs that deal with this from your teachers. But when you talk about colonial comparisons on an essay, on an SAQ, on a multiple choice, everybody's involved in mercantilism. Everybody's involved in the triangle trade. Everyone is subject to Britain's mercantilism that involves the Navigation Acts. Everybody's engaged in some smuggling and ignoring the Navigation Acts and salutary neglect. They're both relying on farming. They're not exporting finished goods. That's part of mercantilism, right? They're relying on raw materials. So that's something that you can do with any sort of colonial comparison, and that should be fairly important for you. And then lastly, letter C, briefly explain one reason for a difference between the economy of the Chesapeake colonies and the economy of the middle colonies. I would talk about soil. I would talk about growing season length, right? As you go farther south, it gets longer. The soil is a little bit more lush. It's a little bit more well-watered, and there's going to be more labor-intensive cash crops going on there. I might also talk about why people found those places. So is it a joint stock company? Is it a New Netherlands trading post in the case of New York? Is it a proprietary colony in the sense of both Baltimore and Maryland, and then William Penn in Pennsylvania? That's a similarity, but you could talk about how those evolved over time, perhaps, and what the reasons were for each person to found those. And then diversity of colonies. Keep in mind the middle colonies have Dutch people, Quakers. They're much more diverse, and that's going to lead to some differences as well. And then the economy is also going to be different because of just the climate in general. So you could talk about that. So that was one of your options. If you wanted to go back to period 2, feel free, because notice period 2 is 1607 to 1754, Jamestown to the beginning of the 7 Years' War. So this is clearly colonial era. Then it asks about, in letter number 4, this is your other option, a similarity between the New Deal and the Great Society, a difference between them, and then a reason for a difference. There is a ton of stuff here. The College Board loves to make comparisons between the New Deal and the Great Society, just like they love to make comparisons between the 20s and the 50s, between the United States getting involved in foreign wars, and all that good stuff. So in this case, New Deal and Great Society, similarities. Deficit spending. These are welfare and social safety net programs, right? It's the government spending money to help people out socially. These are both liberal programs. They're both going to be opposed by conservatives who don't think that they're going to be successful, or they don't like the way that they're using their money. And both lead to lasting reforms and entitlement programs, right? Social Security in the sense of the New Deal, Medicare, Medicaid in the sense of the Great Society programs. Again, mention one from both if you can. That's a great way to make sure you get yourself some points there. Both include programs to support the arts and humanities, right? There's the Federal Writers Project for the New Deal, whereas the Great Society is going to have things like the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. That's kind of a big deal. And then both lead to, backlashes of different sorts, right? So the New Deal is going to lead to a conservative backlash in terms of limiting FDR's terms later that maybe could work. The Supreme Court doesn't like it and strikes some things down. And the Great Society leads to a whole bunch of backlash, aka the rise of conservatism and eventually the rise of Reagan. B, a reason for a difference between the two. Well, this is absolutely because you can talk about the context. And Louisa says the New Deal was unsuccessful because of Roosevelt's recession of 37 and 38, increased unemployment again, while the Great Society was successful because it improved society with resources like Social Security. Remember, Social Security is part of the New Deal. You could argue that one was successful and one was not. Those are both hotly debated topics to the present. Yeah. So if you wanted to say, yeah, the New Deal was unsuccessful because of the Roosevelt recession of 37, 38, whereas the Great Society was successful because we eventually had those programs last, it's kind of difficult. One could also argue that the New Deal was more successful because it eventually morphed into World War II. The Great Society was unsuccessful because it leads to stagflation. It's controversial, but as long as you keep them separate, remember, Social Security is New Deal, Medicare, Medicaid is Great Society. A difference between the two, I would definitely go into the context, where the Great Society involves civil rights legislation. The New Deal is very much so a segregated document. Ira Katz-Nelson in his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, talks about it as being marked for whites only. And so a lot of those discriminate. The Agricultural Adjustment Agency discriminates against sharecroppers. Social Security doesn't apply to sharecroppers or housemaids or other predominantly African-American populations. And so it's fairly segregated. You can talk about that. You could talk about how the New Deal is largely economic focused, whereas Great Society is a lot broader. It's trying to work for some racial equity as well. You could talk about how the New Deal Society programs were intended to be very temporary as kind of a jolt start, but then the fact that the Great Society is a lot more permanent, right? So you have like Head Start and things that are meant to have a lasting impact. African-American exclusion for the New Deal versus civil rights in the Great Society. Yes, Austin, that would absolutely work. Yep, I would say a little bit more, just flesh that out a little bit. But yeah, that's a great way to start it. New Deal wanted to give people jobs, and then Great Society wanted to give them financial assistance and education, access to resources. Yeah. So there are some options there. You could also just talk about how they exist. Again, I would go back to the context, right? New Deal is trying to deal with the Great Depression, and so a lot of it's focused on big, overarching, the banking holiday things, and the FDIC and the SEC, whereas the Great Society programs are much more about poverty and racism during the 60s under Johnson. And then a reason for a difference between the two. This is also where, if you haven't talked about context yet, you should probably talk about the context. And so the New Deal is a response to the Great Depression. The Great Society is a response to civil rights and new left movements. One of them is a war on poverty versus getting people back to work, right? So expand on your answer in letter B. But either way, again, if you're doing some comparison, please try to have something from both sections. There's a lot of options there. I don't want to spend too much time on that just because I want to make sure that I'm helping you out, especially if you're taking the exam tomorrow or you want to learn some more for later. Again, if you want to ask some questions and I haven't covered these so far, feel free to ask a question down below or put it into the chat so we can answer them as we go. Let's look at the first document. The first document-based question. There's only one on the exam. You have no choice, so you have to know the rubric. I have graded document-based questions, I want to say 2 years now at the APUSH reading, and I can't tell you how many students I've given a 0 or a 1 to because they know some history, but they don't know the rubric. So that's crucial, right? You also want to make sure that you're using evidence, as much evidence as you possibly can. You're only required to do evidence, outside evidence, maybe once or twice, but you also want to have some for contextualization. You want to have some in your HIP. You want to have value-added things so that they want to give you as many points as you can. So outside evidence, you also use the documents. The documents count as evidence. Use them as examples in your essay. I know the document-based question has a lot of moving parts. People have a lot of questions about this. But the best way that I like to describe to my students as to how you use it and then you analyze it is use it by summarizing or paraphrasing and tying it back to your thesis. And then in terms of the analysis, give us an example. Say, this is what was happening during the time period. And now as an example, I'm going to talk about this document. And that's where you do the hipping, right, which is very important. And of course, you need to know dates. Because when don't you need to know dates in APUSH? Because it's APUSH, right? So make sure that you know your dates as you work along with the DBQ. So let's dive into that a little bit. The DBQ prompt this year, I think, was fairly accessible. Evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. This is a fairly accessible prompt. Everybody talks about the progressives, right? Now, this probably means people that are taking it tomorrow, you're probably not going to have the progressives. But the progressives could show up in an SAQ. They could show up in a multiple choice. So you need to know about these anyway. And we'll talk about some ways in which you can use the documents here. Again, pay attention to the dates, right? The progressive era is around 1890 to 1920, but this means you can't just talk about things that happened during the Gilded Age. You need to go into the progressive presidents, right? Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. You want to be talking about those guys too, and you can go all the way up to 1920, which they probably give you 1920 because that's when women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Kind of a big deal. Whereas 1890 is the first election of that happens once the frontier is closed. So we're sort of transitioning as a country, getting more into the progressive movement toward the end of the Gilded Age. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Before we get into the documents themselves, what could you use as contextualization? I like to stress to my students doing something that makes sense to them from their English classes, where they set the stage with that sort of inverted triangle, right, where you start a little broader, then you get more specific toward your thesis. In this case, I like to start with something that happens a little bit beforehand and then gradually moves into the time period. So talking about the Gilded Age, the rise of industrialization and urbanization, which creates the problems that progressivism tries to address. That'd be great. Imperialism, U.S. expanding its role in the world. I believe it's Walter McDougall who calls imperialism progressivism overseas. It's just overseas expansion. It's the progressives, remember, are all about this top-down experts lead sort of model. and that applies to governmental reforms. It also applies to overseas imperialism. And so we're going to teach those. We're going to teach those poor Filipinos, they might say, quote unquote, how to do their government better, and thus why we take them over and why we hold them. Notice the air quotes that I used there, right? You could talk about the Great Migration happening during this time, the populist movement that was also another grassroots organization happening during this time. You could mention earlier reform movements. I wouldn't go all the way back to the antebellum reform movements, but if you mention the fact that women have been pressing for suffrage for years and you want to start with Seneca Falls and then move into other later time periods, that would be fine as well. But don't go too far back. What could you use as outside evidence? There is ample outside evidence that you could use. However, I always like to look through the documents first to make sure that I don't have them duplicated. We won't do that right now, but again, that's a suggestion for you that are taking other AP history courses and or taking it tomorrow. Make sure that your outside evidence is not duplicated in any of the documents. Be thinking about it as you read, perhaps. Maybe dump some down right away, but don't spend a ton of time intensely working with one of them because it might be in one of the documents. And if you can't think of any, the documents might spur some of your thinking. So in this case, what could you use? 19th Amendment, I already mentioned. They don't mention all of the presidents. They don't mention Taft, so you could potentially use them. Let's see. You could probably talk about the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, Interstate Commerce Commission, and then a whole bunch of amendments, right? 16, 17, 18, 19, the progressive amendments. I always tell people to remember the amendments 13 through 19 by remembering free citizens vote to tax. Free is 13. So free, equal citizens, free and equal citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. So we're going to have some election of senators. We're going to have some prohibition. We're going to have some income taxes, and we're also going to have women getting the right to vote. So Annie is correct. The 17th Amendment works very nicely. You could talk about the muckrakers, the jungle, Upton Sinclair, the Pure Food and Drug Act, especially if you looked at last year's SAQs, right? Teddy Roosevelt and the muckrakers and the Pure Food and Drug Act is the big deal there. Triangle Short Rice Factory Fire, the Square Deal. You could mention Teddy Roosevelt getting involved in the anthracite coal strike, the Clayton Antitrust Act, Boss Tweed. There are some various items you could go with, but you have a lot of those. But remember, you can't use ones that are explicitly mentioned in the documents. So you can't use Jane Addams. You can't use Hull House. You can't use Teddy Roosevelt just by himself. Initiative, referendum, recall. You can't mention those. Yeah. Mr. Garcia, you say, what tips do you give to students in terms of how to use outside evidence? As a reader, is there a style that students use to make sure their outside evidence points will not be missed and will receive points? I will say that readers read things very carefully, and as we're skimming, we can definitely tell if there's any sort of vocab that stands out as we read, absolutely. So even if you're just looking at it real quick, you can kind of notice those words because you've been reading so many of these. And then once you actually dive in and read the essay thoroughly, like we do with all of them, we're definitely going to notice. I would say make sure that you have at least one piece of evidence in your contextualization, right? So you want to say Gilded Age, something with the proper noun vocab that is involved there somewhere. And then you always want to define it and tie it back to the prompt because it has to be relevant, right? And then you don't want to have any in your thesis as much as you can avoid it, right? Because then you need to be able to prove it later and you want to be able to put it into your body paragraphs. As long as their outside evidence is in the body paragraphs and it's capitalized if it needs to be, it's defined, and then it tells me why I should care and how it ties back to their thesis. Oh, that is just beautiful. That's what you want to do with outside evidence. You want to make sure you're dropping the vocab, you're describing and defining what it is, and then telling me why I should care. Essentially, again, Johnny Burkowski's ACE method for answering SAQs, answer, cite, explain, where you say, okay, here's what it is, here's the vocab and defined it, and then now here's why explained, here's why you should care about it. I think that works really well for outside evidence points during the DBQ. So let's dive into some of these documents. Yeah, no problem. Glad I could help with that. Let's dive into some of these prompts here. First one, Jane Addams, Hull House. This was a previous stimulus-based multiple choice question, so you should be somewhat familiar with this. Jane Addams shows up all over the place, right? And it's talking about the issue of political machines like Boss Tweed, how they get their power, and how they continue to provide service for people, but it's a little bit sketchy, right? Progressive reform movement was trying to attack these corrupt local state legislatures, and the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment is a way to address this. So if you wanted to mention that outside evidence here, that might work really nicely. Keep in mind that the historical context might be urbanization during this time. It might be political machines, Boss Tweed. I always like to go with historical context for my HIP analysis. I find that that's a little bit easier, but then again, I know a lot of history. And if you don't know a whole lot of history, it might be a good idea to dive in a little bit more and then look at some of the IPP stuff, the intended audience, the purpose, the point of view. Keep in mind that Jane Addams, like a lot of other progressives, is going to be an upper middle class woman, particularly white women who are very involved. So you could talk about that. And that's where she comes from. Talk about how it influences her and talk about who she's trying to talk about and talk to. So 20 years at Hull House, she's going to be talking about her work at a settlement house. And she's probably going to be talking about how in 1910, there's still work to be done. And here's how we did it in the past. You can learn from this. You can continue to build on this, something like that. Document question number 2, President Theodore Roosevelt, the speech at Providence, Rhode Island. He's talking about the great corporations, right? So this is the whole good trusts, bad trusts. And it says trusts in there, so that's not outside evidence, but good trusts, bad trusts, that's a famous thing that TR is talking about, especially in comparison to Wilson or other kinds of trust busters and Taft as well. So if you want to talk about Teddy Roosevelt and how he's speaking to other people as a politician, he's trying to get them riled up. He's trying to get them to follow his lead and talking about how he's going to bust some trusts during this time. It's talking about the power of the robber barons, right? And they want to break up trusts. Theodore Roosevelt is a progressive and a progressive president, and he's trying to break up trusts not just for economic reasons, but also because they just have too much social power, right? And they don't want to use that power to control state legislatures. I'm thinking in my mind, of the Rockefeller as the giant octopus cartoon that you've perhaps seen. And so you can mention a little bit of that Standard Oil kind of stuff and having too much power and having the power at the ballot and things like that. Again, you want to make sure that you're looking through the citations here because they're very, very helpful. Always read the source. And document 3 was a little bit tricky for a lot of people, right? So they said juveniles. Well, we haven't talked about that. Your textbook probably doesn't talk about that, right? But this is kind of talking about the social gospel movement, kind of ministering to street orphans. You could talk about orphan trains as outside evidence. But notice it's in the Harvard Law Review and it says juvenile court. So pay attention to the word juvenile. Oh, they're talking about juvenile delinquents, kids, street urchins. You can also see juvenile offenders, boys and girls, and then criminality and things like that. You don't want to punish them, but you want to reform them, not degrade them, but to uplift them, not to crush, but develop, as it says. Not to make him a citizen, but a worthy citizen. Not make him a criminal, but a worthy citizen. He's writing in the Harvard Law Review, thus Julian Mack, presumably, is some sort of lawyer, or at least he's writing to other lawyers who probably have some sort of political power and are able to influence this. So far, we have a settlement house woman, we have a president talking about trusts, and we have a juvenile court in the Harvard Law Review. These are very different, but you can use them in different ways. And remember, you want to use 6 of them. You want to use 6 documents where you paraphrase it, you put it in your own words, and you tie it into your thesis. And then you need to be able to HIP, that is, deeply analyze 3 of them. But I would suggest that you do more just in case you don't do it well. So you do have some mulligans, you do have some skips, you have some documents you don't necessarily have to engage with. So if this one seems super confusing, you can skip it, but keep in mind, you only get a certain number of those. And in terms of using, you only get 1. So do pay attention to the source. Don't get too freaked out. As long as you can read, and we're not going to spend the time reading here because I want to make sure I respect your time. But if you just read through it and then you sort of are able to put it in your own words and say, oh, they're worried about kids that are turning to a life of crime on the streets in the cities, you're getting pretty close toward using this to prove your thesis and thus getting the usage point. So that's kind of a big deal. This one, Governor Hiram Johnson, and he's talking to the California State Legislature, so he's using a bully pulpit as a governor, right? And it's speaking of the 3 political reforms of the progressive era. So this is talking about the initiative, the recall, and the referendum. And this is talking about getting rid of bad politicians. They can propose their own laws. They can remove bad politicians through the recall, right? And the referendum means that they can weigh in on certain laws passed by the legislature. So this is, again, more direct representation. I might tie this in with the previous one that talked about perhaps the Hull House movement and try to tie it into political reforms, taking down political machines, corruption in politics, something like that. Then document 5, you have the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Again, if you want to get inside the mind of the College Board, I have a video about that as well. But in this case, I would just say, look, they're clearly wanting you to talk about African Americans during this time. The progressive movement is not just a whole bunch of white people doing things for white people, right? So with the NAACP, they're writing a letter to President Woodrow Wilson. Now, those of you that read James Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, my students did over the summer, they'll remember that there's a whole chapter that talks about heroes who are perhaps too deified, made to look too good. And Woodrow Wilson is one of those because, remember, he segregates the civil service of the United States government. He resegregates it. He makes sure that blacks and whites cannot work together, unlike his predecessors, Taft and TR. So that's actually the historical context for this. You could use it. The NAACP is trying to connect with the world's most powerful individual in the United States. They're going straight to the top. They're trying to make sure that they can get some reform done. And it's an unsuccessful attempt to try to force them to desegregate, but at least they're trying, and that's their purpose. That's their point of view. And it's talking about a political reform to segregate federal employees. But the NAACP doesn't buy it. They don't think that's a reform. They think that's a regression. That's going backwards in time. And so some jobs are just for African Americans, and they're saying, well, that protects you. That means that you can for sure have jobs. But they don't buy that. And they say, you know what? This doesn't work for us, and there's not political progress. So the progressives, although they're built on progress, aren't always progressing that much. So this reminds you to remember the African Americans and remember the fact that the progressives sometimes are a little bit racist. Document 6, this one was also throwing a lot of people for a loop. But again, this is a Detroit commissioner of police and former general manager of the Ford Motor Company, but he's mostly talking about police officers, right? And he's talking about scientific management and reflecting back on his time of working in the Ford Motor Company. If you remember the vocab word Taylorism, you are golden, you have outside evidence, and you can talk about this whole thing. But either way, it's talking about putting experts in charge, right? This is talking about making sure that people who know what they're doing are put in charge. So the Federal Reserve is a fantastic example, the Federal Trade Commission. Either way, progressives, Taylorism included, believe that experts should be in charge, not ordinary people. Although, obviously, there's some nuance there with the referendum, the recall, and the initiative. So that would be a great complexity point if you talked about both of those items. And then document 7. Document 7 is the, well, it screams prohibition to you, right? But it's the one document that's not just an excerpt, and it has a picture. And so this is clearly talking about wet and dry. And it even says in the citation, read the citation, please. It's the Anti-Saloon League. And the Anti-Saloon League is, of course, going to be anti-saloon, which means against drinking and against gambling that occurs in those dens of sin and things like that. And so this is going to be about the 18th Amendment, which, remember, gets repealed by the 21st Amendment because you can drink when you're 21 in a lot of states in the United States. So document 7, again, it's hard to talk about the historical context without mentioning prohibition and the 18th Amendment. In terms of the intended audience, it seems like this person definitely, and perspective and point of view. By the way, I should mention this as it's very important. When you're doing the I or the P for the HIP on your document-based question for your HIP analysis, please try to do all of them together. You only have to do one technically, but as we've been reading and as I've been talking to my colleagues, it turns out that you really can't do one well without the other. For example, you can't say, this was written to other Americans as the intended audience and then just stop there, right? That doesn't work. But if you say this was written to other Americans in order to convince them to vote for prohibition, or if you said this was published by the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, sorry, it's not published by them, Annie. Yeah, I misspoke. But that certainly is historical context. There are many other groups that are against alcohol, and they're perhaps talking to them. So you could say this was written to other people to try to get them to support other anti-alcohol organizations as well. So that would work as historical context, absolutely. And you want to talk about purpose and point of view. So you want to say this is an anti-drinking bill that was published during the time of trying to get prohibition to pass. And that would be a really good way to get some of that stuff done. So again, make sure that you're using the documents in a way that ties back to your thesis. Make sure you're paying attention to nuance, pay attention to connections between documents, and that's a good way to go. Let's talk some LEQs. Keep in mind, again, know the rubric, use outside evidence, dates, just like we talked about with the DBQ. But this time you have choices. You have 3 questions. We're going to go through these relatively quickly just because there's not a whole lot of complexity. There's not documents to go through. but there is outside evidence, so we'll talk about some options there. LEQ number, so again, the DBQ is question number 1, so the LEQs are technically question 2, 3, and 4, so in case you're a little bit confused there. So the first LEQ option, or question number 2, is evaluate the extent to which ideas of self-government influenced American colonial reaction to British imperial authority in the period from 1754 to 1776. Now, that's a lot of words there. 2 big things that stand out to me. 1, this is clearly about the road to the revolution. 2, it says ideas about self-government influenced. That means this is a causation question, perhaps, although you're welcome to do other historical thinking skills. But you have to talk about ideas of self-government, right? So what is self-government? And how are you going to make this work? So there's a variety of things you can talk about. Notice the dates here are from the beginning of the 7 Years' War all the way until the Declaration of Independence, as well as the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So all of that works. So what do you want to mention here? You probably want to mention the French and Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War. How does that change things? How it ends salutary neglect? You want to talk about how ideas of self-government come from maybe the First Great Awakening, come from the Enlightenment, come from John Locke, come from salutary neglect because they had these ideas of self-government that came from economic self-government. You could talk about the colonial legislatures, right? The Virginia House of Burgesses that gave them a history of self-government, and they had those ideas that should continue. You could talk about the Stamp Act and the colonial response. So again, there's a little bit of a cause and effect here. You do have to talk about ideas of self-government, but then you can just continue to go on there. For those of you taking an exam other than this one, please make sure you read the entire prompt, right? If you don't talk about the ideas of self-government and you just talk about American colonial reaction, you're not addressing the prompt and you miss out on a lot of points, right? It just doesn't work that well. So personally, I would contextualize this with talking about some mercantilism and then move into the 7 Years' War and talking about how Americans believe they should rule themselves because they've been doing that for a while. The Albany Plan of Union fails because they like self-government. You can talk about the Enlightenment ideas of self-government, and you're off to the LEQ races. Question number 3, which I liked, and most of my students did too. Most of them did this one. This was, in my mind, a gimme, a gift from APUSH. Evaluate the extent to which debates over slavery in the period from 1830 to 1860 led the United States into the Civil War. My goodness, if your APUSH teacher didn't cover this, I think you were asleep, because they did, right? So debates over slavery from 1830 to 1860. Again, notice the dates. You can't use the Missouri Compromise for outside evidence, but you could use it as excellent contextualization. You could talk about the Northwest Ordinance. You could talk about the era of good feelings and how that's soon to be rendered asunder. It's going to be ripped apart by the sectional tensions between the North and the South. You could talk about the cotton gin and the American system and the growth of cotton down south, something like that. And then in terms of potential evidence, oh man, do you have so many of these, right? So you could talk about Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion, because that's in 1830s. You can talk about The Liberator, which comes out the same year with William Lloyd Garrison. You can talk about anything that involves moving west after this point, because remember, westward expansion equals problems over slavery. So debates over slavery lead the United States into the Civil War. So you can talk Missouri Compromise for Contextualization, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Compromise of 1850, Mexican Cession, the Liberty Party, the Fugitive Slave Act. There's Lincoln-Douglas debates. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Bleeding Kansas. Heck, you can even go to South Carolina's secession, because that's in 1860 in December. But after Lincoln gets elected, you can use Lincoln's election. A lot of options there. However, again, it's not nearly as straightforward, though, unless you read the entire prompt. So debates over slavery, okay, I got that, led the United States into the Civil War. So you want to talk about how that led the United States into the Civil War. So you talk about the North and the South getting increasingly divided over slavery. You can talk about how even things like tariffs and states' rights issues went back into this idea of slavery, and how a lot of these leaders down south, culminating, of course, in their articles of secession, think Alexander H. Stevens, etc., we're talking about how, well, the North isn't living up to its constitutional obligations to follow the law. And you're not having them return our slaves like they said they were going to with the Fugitive Slave Act. And of course, they then complain about how the North is not fulfilling their obligations about slavery, therefore they need to leave, and they're going to found a government that's based on the great truth that, again, notice the air quotes, the Negro is not the white man's equal, and that they're going to be a government founded on that ideal. which is a little bit scary. But again, you need to talk about how this leads the United States into a civil war, and secession is probably going to need to be the end of that for sure. Let's see, Annie, yeah, creating tensions and political parties. Yeah, if you talk about how the tensions lead to the creation of new political parties, the emergence of the Republican Party, the fact that the Republican Party is a purely sectional party, right? It's only North. Lincoln's not even on the ballot in the South. All of that stuff works for sure. Caning of Sumner, Fire Eaters, Lincoln, Douglas, I already said that. John Brown, Harper's Ferry. There's a ton of stuff here, and this was a major emphasis of APUSH. So hopefully you did all right on this one. And then last but not least, oops, sorry, we should probably go forward, not backward. That's a typo. Should be question number 4. But evaluate the extent to which ideas about democracy contributed to the African-American civil rights movement in the period from 1940 to 1970. So again, this is one of those ones you need to read the full prompt, right? You need to be talking about, okay, what are ideas about democracy? What does democracy look like? That's people getting involved. And what are the ideas about democracy? And then how do they contribute to the African-American civil rights movement? You can't just say, Rosa Parks, MLK, something about Jim Crow, and then you think you're okay. So those of you that are taking different ones, remember, you want to read the entire question and answer. In this case, it kind of has 2 parts. It's a causation question. What are the ideas about democracy? Probably about participation, right? Marches, boycotts. Democracy equals participation. It's not just voting, although that's important as well. And then how does that contribute to the African-American civil rights movement? That is the African-American civil rights movement. They're saying we're going to participate in the ways that we can so that we can get even increasing ways to participate. So again, and then pay attention to the dates, of course. So the fact that it says 1940 to 1970, 1940 means you can talk about World War II, A. Philip Randolph, the Double V campaign. You have lots of options here. I would probably contextualize with World War II, but you can even go back further, talk about the founding of the NAACP. You could talk about Jim Crow laws, the racial nadir, right, the low point in race relations. You could talk about white flight that happens during suburbanization. You could talk about the GI Bill, lots of options there. You can even talk about the Cold War. If it happens during period 8, it probably involves the Cold War somewhat. So you can talk about World War II, Cold War, and then the United States was fighting for democracy during World War II. We were fighting for democracy during the Cold War, and yet we had this problem with hypocrisy at home. How do we make that work? So that's pretty good contextualization. And then in terms of what you can use for outside evidence, I would probably, ideas about democracy, mention Roosevelt's 4 freedoms if you can. Mention the Double V campaign. Mention the fact that African Americans go off and fight, Tuskegee Airmen style, etc. Truman's Executive Order 9981 that desegregates the military. Lots of options there. And then when you get into the actual civil rights movement itself, you can say, well, notice that they were participating, which is democracy, citizens getting involved, and then mention all the different items. So you can talk about the Montgomery bus boycott. You can mention the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. You can mention the Greensboro sit-ins. You could mention that they're fighting and marching during Freedom Summer, Freedom Rides. You could mention the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and how it takes a bunch of marches to get that happening. You could mention the March, Selma March, in order to get the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Voting Rights Act of 68, and that's about housing and other sorts of desegregation. So you have lots of options. But then also ideas about democracy start to shift because remember, a big part of the APUSH curriculum is that the civil rights movement starts to stall and fragment. So you, at the end, nearing 1970, you can start talking about Stokely Carmichael, the rise of Black Power, the Black Panther movement, Bayard Rustin, lots of options there. And you can use a whole bunch of those. So ideas about democracy could include the right to self-defense and the Second Amendment, which the Black Panthers kind of throw in the face of their white opponents. You could mention how ideas about democracy are controversial. Should we fight back? Should we stand up for ourselves? Should we get hurt? Should we not? So lots of options there for LEQ number 4. And I'm going to switch that for you and then also share this link out in the chat for everybody to look at. So while we're doing this, any last minute questions that I can answer because we are almost done. Any questions about the exam or suggestions for the future that I could perhaps... I'm not able to, let's see, anybody with the link can access. Well, that's good. I'll see if I can get that link for you folks in just a second. Any other questions that I can help to answer at this time? Again, sort of parting advice as we're talking about this, make sure that you're answering the full question, right? There you go. There's the slides for you. got a bit.ly link at the end. Make sure you're answering the full question. Make sure that whenever you use a term, you define it and you connect it back to the topic at hand, to the prompt, to your thesis, to the SAQ. Never, excuse me, never just give a laundry list of a whole bunch of different vocab words. Make sure that you're able to show that you know what you're talking about and explain why you know what you're talking about, and make sure you tell them why they should give you points because you're smart and awesome. Any other questions or concerns? Again, I'm going to drop that in the chat real quick just to make sure that we have that if we need to. Otherwise, folks, thanks for joining us. Best of luck to those of you that are taking the APUSH exam tomorrow because you're taking the late one. And for those of you that are done with APUSH, don't stress, but I hope that it goes well for you in July. As we read these essays in June, we will be thinking about you, and we will be giving you a fair read and making sure that we do our best in order to give you as many points as we can by looking at your essays carefully. And if you take AP World, AP Euro next year, or any of the AP classes, obviously come back to Fiveable with us here, and we'll be talking about this again next year with some review videos. And then also don't forget that a lot of these are transferable skills, right? So it's not just the Fiveable videos that pertain to your particular subject, but this one talking about how you can answer the SAQs, LEQs, and DBQs. It applies to the other ones as well. And make sure that you're looking at some of the older videos if you have that Fiveable Plus subscription and looking at like why dates matter, et cetera, and then you can get a good head start on that. I'm not seeing any more questions, so it sounds like we're good. I hope you folks have a fantastic night. Good luck on the exam tomorrow, and have a great summer.